The first day of December 1943, 7 liberators from the 42nd Bomb Squadron lifted off from Funafuti to strike the Japanese airfield at Mille. Among them was Lieutenant George Deckshirt's plane, flying with a substitute assistant engineer, Staff Sergeant Bob Leip, borrowed from Joe Deasy's crew. Leip's own engineer had broken his collarbone 2 weeks earlier, crashing and knotting a net because a forgotten ammo box blocked the nose wheel from deploying. That small mistake set a deadly chain in motion. Before dawn, Leip tucked his .45 pistol under Sergeant Herman Scearce's mattress, the dark joke being that a sidearm was useless against an enemy who would shoot you down anyway. Bob Leip was 22 years old from Columbiana, Ohio, a popular mechanic who drove a Model A Ford lettered Mayflower and joked it carried many a girl. As the assistant engineer on Deasy's crew, he liked to tease Ed Hess about pretending to be an officer, and he goaded Jack Yankus into drunken singing. On December 1st, he climbed into Deschirt's plane, and the 7 bombers headed north. 3 turned back with mechanical trouble. 3 reached Mill. Deschert made his bomb run, then disappeared. No radio call, no position report. The plane simply never came home. Back on Funafuti, Scearce listened to the radio watch. There was no contact from Deschirt's plane. He knew the crew's history of near disaster, and he remembered the ammo box. Days later, Bob Leip's last letter reached his mother, Leah Hitchcock, in Ohio on December 14th. That same afternoon, a War Department telegram arrived reporting him missing. She never saw her son again. Scearce kept the .45 and kept the secret of the ammo box, the one detail that made Leip's substitution a death sentence. On December 20th, the squadron flew again, this time against Taroa Island in the Maloelap Atoll. 9 B-24s took off, including Lieutenant George Smith's Dogpatch Express, flown with Lieutenant Thompson's crew. While Thompson recovered from a leg wound, the formation hit intense anti-aircraft fire over the target, flak bursts greeting them ahead. A 20mm shell knocked out Engine 4 on Dogpatch Express and drilled holes through the fuselage. Another shell tore through the cockpit and exploded, wounding co-pilot John Lowry and shattering the top turret where Sergeant Clarence Sopko sat. Smith feathered the dead engine and shut down number 3 after it caught fire, then restarted it, but the engine smoked again and the plane lost altitude. Japanese Zero swarmed the crippled bomber. Captain Jesse Stay circled back with the other planes, forming a defensive ring around Dogpatch Express, but the fighters pressed their attacks. At 90 miles east of Maloelap, Smith ditched. The B-24 broke in half on impact, the nose sinking fast. Survivors scrambled onto a raft. 1-0 made a strafing pass over the raft, killing or wounding the men in the water. No one was ever rescued. That same day, another 42nd pilot, Lieutenant Charlie Pratt, fought his riddled Belle of Texas back to Tarawa. With no hydraulics, no brakes, and one engine dead, Pratt ordered his crew to buckle parachutes to the gun mounts. As the plane touched down on the short fighter strip, gunners tossed the parachutes out the waist windows. The improvised brakes slowed the bomber just enough to stop at the water's edge. The crew counted more than 300 holes in the airframe. They were unhurt. It was a miraculous landing on a day of heartbreaking loss. The 42nd Bomb Squadron packed up what remained of its gear on Funafuti and sailed for Oahu in late December of '43. The men arrived at Hickam Field on January 9, 1944, their crates waterlogged, their barracks bags moldy from 13 days at sea. The squadron was taken off combat duty and given a new mission, training replacement crews fresh from the States. For Scearce, that meant 6 weeks of drills in navigation, gunnery, water landings, and radar bombing techniques, work that suited his quiet, careful nature. In March, the squadron moved to Kahuku, a desolate stretch of Oahu's north shore where there was little to do but wait out the reconstruction. Shortly after the squadron's arrival, Captain Joe Deasy was diagnosed with tuberculosis and sent to a hospital in Colorado, leaving his crew leaderless and the squadron under new command. 3 months later, on the night of April 16th, a brand new B-24 called Heavy Date lifted off from Eniwetok for a bombing run against the Japanese base at Truk. The navigator miscalculated the plane's position over the Black Pacific, and hours into the return flight, the fuel gauges sank toward empty. Radio operator Carl Swift tapped out a stream of desperate Morse code messages to the ground station at Eniwetok, giving coordinates and reporting the plane was down to its last hour of fuel. The ground operator relayed that a Dumbo flying boat was on its way. Swift screwed down his transmitter key to brace for impact. The bomber hit the water and broke apart quickly. 4 men climbed into a raft and survived. Swift and 4 others were trapped inside the fuselage and went down with the wreckage. On September 22, 1944, the ground echelon of the 42nd Bomb Squadron stepped off the transport ships into the mud of Guam. Rain fell in sheets, turning the island's volcanic soil into a thick, clinging mire that sucked at boots and bogged down trucks. The men had been at sea for 32 days, and the welcome they got was a flooded landscape of crushed coral and rotting Japanese bunkers. Their job was to build an airbase from nothing, a forward staging ground for liberators that would carry the war closer to Japan. Every tent peg had to be hammered into standing water. Every crate of gear carried through ankle-deep sludge. It was a logistical nightmare, but the men understood why they were here. Guam sat just 1,500 miles from Tokyo. From this island, the 42nd would reach targets they had only dreamed of hitting a year before. By late October, the camp began to take shape. The Navy Seabees helped where they could, but most of the work fell to the airmen themselves. They built Quonset huts with concrete floors, mess halls with screened sides, and a mission briefing room that soon became the heart of the squadron. Inside that hut, on a simple wooden easel, stood a large strategic bombing map of Iwo Jima. Herman Scearce walked past that map many times in those early weeks. He noticed the heavy black lines that marked the Japanese runways, the contour lines tracing the island's volcanic slopes. It was still just a map then, a future target. But Scearce knew, as every man in the squadron knew, that they would soon be staring down at that island for real through a bomb sight. On the morning of October 28, 1944, Captain Jesse Stay led 12 B-24s off the Coral Runway at Agana Airfield. Their target was the Japanese airfield at Colonia on the island of Yap. Scearce was aboard Stay's plane, working the radios as the formation climbed to altitude over the bright blue Pacific. The flight took just 6 hours and 25 minutes, the shortest combat mission Scearce would ever fly. The bombardier put Stay's 6 500-pound bombs directly across the anti-aircraft battery north of the airfield. Japanese gunners fired back with 36 inaccurate bursts of flak, and not a single enemy fighter rose to meet them. It was, by the standards of the Pacific War, an easy mission. On the return leg, Stay's plane blew a hydraulic hose on the right main landing gear. Brown fluid streamed down the strut as the Liberator touched down and the bomber rolled long on Guam's runway with no brakes, finally coasting to a stop. The crew climbed out, stiff and tired, and Scearce added the mission to his mental tally. It was his 7th strike credit. 11 months had passed since his last combat flight, and now, at last, the squadron was back in the fight. The pace would quicken soon enough. Guam was their springboard, and the missions to come would be longer, harder, and far more costly. On the morning of November 6, 1944, 7 B-24 Liberators of the 42nd Bomb Squadron lifted off from Guam and flew first to Saipan. Their ground crews removed the conventional bomb racks from the bays and installed special racks for a new kind of ordnance, 2,000-pound mines, each one charged with 1,274 pounds of TNT. These were the first Mike missions, code name for mine-laying operations against Japanese-held harbors, and the men hated them on principle. Every airman knew that altitude meant safety, and these missions demanded they fly at just 50 feet above the water, low enough to see the foam kicked back by their own propellers. The mines were fragile, designed to be dropped at speeds under 200 knots, and they were aimed not at a visible target, but at a timed release point after passing a certain shoreline feature. Captain Jesse Stay led the flight, and Technical Sergeant Herman Scearce flew with him as radio operator and radar observer. The approach to Onijima was uneventful. The Japanese defenders caught completely by surprise. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire too late, and the 7 Liberators were already past the release point, speeding away at treetop height, with their mines settled into the harbor below. For Scearce, this mission was the payoff of months of experimental work with the squadron's radar officer, Captain Charlie Bunn. They had developed radar scope photography techniques and high-altitude bombing procedures that made the squadron uniquely suited for this new tactical role. The citation would later read that the supplying of the enemy for development of bases was definitely retarded, and for his part in that first Mike mission, Scearce received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The squadron flew 9 Mike missions in less than 6 weeks, and Scearce flew every one of them. His strike credit count, which had crawled to 7 over 19 months, suddenly jumped to 16. Each mission followed the same pattern. Stage through Saipan, load the mines, fly low and fast to the target harbor, release the ordnance on a timed signal, and race away at full throttle just above the chop of the ocean. The men complained bitterly that this was the Navy's job, not the Air Corps', but the results spoke for themselves. Shipping between Chichijima and Iwo Jima dropped off substantially, and the Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima, which had no harbor of its own and relied entirely on sea supply, began to feel the squeeze. On November 29th, 4 liberators took off from Saipan for a mine-laying mission to Chichijima. The flight followed an unusual route, approaching the harbor over the mountains instead of from the sea, threading through a narrow canyon between peaks. Lieutenant Phil Crow led the formation in a tight diamond, flying so close that his wingtips overlapped those of his wingmen. The turbulence was treacherous, the canyon walls visible from the waist gunners' positions on either side, and when Crow cleared the ridgeline and pushed over hard to hug the slope, his wingmen lost sight of him in the confined space. Lieutenant Bob Strong, flying on the left, banked hard to regain position and felt a violent bump. His right wingtip had slapped the nose of Lieutenant Herb Robinson's ship, missing the whirling propellers by a few feet. A 1,000-pound mine from Robinson's bomb bay had been released at that exact instant. Instead of falling clear, it crashed through the side of Strong's fuselage, punching a hole 3 feet by 6 feet wide, just behind the right waist gun. A 6-foot parachute attached to the mine designed to slow its descent to the water billowed out full behind the aircraft, dragging the plane downward. The mine itself pinched the elevator and rudder control cables, and a frightening crack raced across the top of the fuselage. The 2 waist gunners, Corporals Vince Sutter and Al Newell, grabbed the fire axe mounted in the fuselage and chopped through the parachute's shroud lines, relieving the vicious drag. Then they wrenched the barrels from their .50 caliber machine guns and used them as improvised crowbars to pry the mine up and out of the side of the plane. The tail section shook and swayed on its own, and through the crack they could see daylight alternately widening and closing as the fuselage flexed. If the tail wrenched free, the Liberator would pitch forward with such force that no one would get out. But the mine fell away, and Strong coaxed the crippled bomber back to Saipan, landing without further incident. The aircraft never flew again, but it was stripped for parts and kept a dozen other planes in commission. On January 22, 1945, Lieutenant Charlie Pratt took off from Saipan in a B-24 designated 42109-871 for a mine-laying mission to Chichijima. Pratt was one of the old-timers in the squadron, the pilot who had crashed the Navy's dedication party at Mullenix Field 13 months before, landing Bell of Texas with no brakes and improvised parachutes to slow the plane. His crew averaged 30 missions per man, and they had survived their brush with death and built a winning streak since. Nothing bad was supposed to happen to a crew like Charlie Pratt's. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners on Chichijima scored hits on a 4-engine bomber flying over the harbor that morning and saw the plane begin to smoke and lose altitude. It crashed into the cliffs above Maruan, a bay on the south side of the island, and part of the plane fell to the beach below. Back on Guam, Scearce returned from a bombing mission to Iwo Jima and learned that Pratt's plane was overdue. Captain Jordan Churchill sent 2 B-24s to search, and one reported sighting smoke and a life raft 9 hours after Pratt had left Saipan. The squadron commander ordered 21 B-24s to cover the area between Guam and Iwo Jima, but they found nothing. On Chichijima, Japanese soldiers followed the beach to the wreck site, but they could not reach the plane where it rested on the cliffs. They found clothing with the name of a gunner, William Farrell, sewn inside, and the tattered remains of 4 letters written to him. They assumed the American flyers were dead, and they were right. The search continued for days from the air, but no survivors were ever found. The men of the squadron tried to imagine a clandestine rescue by submarine or patrol boat, but deep down they knew the odds. The gambler's paradox held no comfort. Winning streaks are illusions, and the loss that ends them feels impossibly unfair. Prate's crew had survived the impossible once, but a second miracle never came. February 8, 1945. 10 B-24 Liberators form up over Guam and set course for Iwo Jima. Lieutenant Herman Beerworth leads Sea Flight, his bomber a new L model with an open tail gun position instead of a turret. The bombs fall away, and the formation banks east toward home. Sunlight flashes off the aluminum skin of the lead planes as they turn through 120 degrees. 2 minutes from the target, a streak crosses above the formation from high at 1 o'clock. A Zero fighter rolls inverted and smashes into Beerworth's bomber at the top turret, precisely where the main wing spar meets the fuselage. The impact breaks the Liberator's back. The right wing tears off, engines still spinning. The tail section tumbles 15,000 feet toward the ocean, with Sergeant Richard Carton trapped inside. Witnesses see 2 parachutes open, but both burst into flames before they can descend, likely soaked in aviation fuel. Every man on Beerworth's crew dies, each one on his 39th mission, just days from finishing 40 and going home. That same night, Technical Sergeant Herman Scearce fastens his seatbelt aboard Captain Jordan Churchill's B-24 for a nighttime strike against Iwo's airfields. Searchlights catch the bomber and hold it for a long, nerve-wracking 30 seconds before Churchill dives and twists into the black safety beyond. February 10th, 10 B-24s climb toward Hahajima, a target considered a milk run compared to the defenses over Iwo. Lieutenant Edwin Brashear flies lead in a new L model named Royal Flush. The plane carries auxiliary fuel tanks in the bomb bay for the longer distance. At 16,000 feet, the formation opens its bomb bay doors and holds a steady course toward the release point. A Japanese anti-aircraft crew tracks Royal Flush for the critical seconds needed to compute their aim. The shell strikes the bomb bay, detonating inside the auxiliary fuel tank. Phosphorus burns through the metal and fire explodes through the fuselage. The plane noses down, flames pouring from the bomb bay, and then breaks apart at altitude. Tail gunner Sergeant Richard Chandler tumbles free, his face and hands burned. He watches the burning wreckage fall 3 miles toward the ocean. Lieutenant Howard Bettis, flying in the formation behind, dives his plane through anti-aircraft fire to search for survivors. He spots 1 parachute in the water and a man struggling nearby. Bettis drops life rafts and radios for rescue. 2.5 hours later, a Navy Dumbo flying boat pulls Chandler from the water. He is the only survivor of the 10-man crew. Major Robert Holland, flying on his 41st mission, dies with the rest. Scearce hears the news when he returns from his own mission that day, his 38th. February 12, 1945, Scearce climbs into a B-24 for a night bombing mission against Iwo Jima. The aircraft carries 100-pound general-purpose bombs, and the flight approaches the island on separate headings to confuse the Japanese gunners. Searchlights sweep the sky but catch no bombers. The bombs fall on airfield number 2 and gun positions north of the strip. On the return flight, Scearce stands at his waist window and watches an unidentified aircraft pass below in the darkness, its running lights blinking against the black Pacific. The triangle of light shrinks and vanishes. 4 hours later, the Liberator touches down on Guam. Scearce climbs from the aircraft, removes his boots in the crew quarters, and lies back on his cot. He whispers softly to no one, 40. Tears fill his eyes and he lets them fall. Captain Charlie Bunn drafts a letter recommending Scearce for a field commission. A board of officers would make it official, and Scearce would pin on gold bars as a second lieutenant and serve as a radar officer in the ground echelon. But Scearce has no job waiting, no wife, no home to return to, only the open question of what comes next. He thanks Bunn and turns down the offer. 3 weeks later, he catches a ride in a worn-out B-24 to Kwajalein, then to Johnston Island, and finally to Oahu, bound for the States. Herman Scearce was honorably discharged at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in June 1945. He returned to Roanoke Rapids, attended high school, married Flora Ann Davenport, and re-enlisted in the new United States Air Force. Retiring as a master sergeant after 21 years of service, Most of the men he flew with made it home and resumed their lives from before the war. Joe Deasy recovered from tuberculosis and returned to civilian life. The disappearance of Charlie Pratt and his crew became a mystery that lasted for decades, until a passage in a post-war account described the Marine search party that reached the crash site on Chichijima and found the letters of gunner William Farrell among the wreckage. The plane had gone down on the cliffs above Maruan Wan, near a red iron rock formation called Heart Rock, an accidental memorial to 10 men who never came home. The rock stands 600 feet tall above the bay and stains the cliff face, the shape of a valentine. Bob Leip's mother wrote Scearce after the war, thanking him for sending a photograph of her son and confessing she was still praying Bobby would come home, a hope she carried long after the telegrams had stopped. If you have a family story from the Pacific War, a letter, a photograph, a name whispered across decades, share it in the comments below. We read every one. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to help us bring more of these stories to light. Thank you for listening.